some remarks on impressions derived from Dugin's account of the subject in relation to his account of Dasein. So first of all, I think one thing he says that's extremely interesting, and it's an answer also, not that he's deliberately made an answer to Zizek, but it is an answer to Zizek's provocation, and in some way aptly decomposes it. So Zizek has said Dugin cheats. So, and in the context of the question of how can Dugin be both claim to be universalist and claim to have the particular special Russian truth. Universalist, apparently Dugin doesn't mention it in this case. So one question directly I would say to Dugin would be, does the universalist mean that because as an Orthodox Russian, you view the truth of the Orthodox Russian truth as applying to all human beings? So the first thing is that he's identified Geworfenheit. So Zizek has put forward this claim that Heidegger is a super transcendentalist, but of course he's made that remark slightly loose remark, and he's clarified, giving exactness to it by saying by the Geworfenheit, by the super transcendentalism, he means exactly the Geworfenheit, or the so-called thrownness. So Dugin has identified Geworfenheit with so the way I understand him, he doesn't use the word modified, but the way I understand him is Heidegger as a modified concept of subjectum, of the Aristotelian notion of subjectum, which still comes down to us in the discussion between Descartes and Hobbes in the 17th century, which brings an end to Western thought and brings in the Enlightenment thought and its European thought, let's say, Aufklärung in its place. Western Greek thought, Greek Christian thought comes to an end. So that chain between Athens and then Rome, and then various theological moves through the Middle Ages, through the Arabs, through Thomas, and etc., then reach a culmination in Enlightenment thinking, which becomes Newtonian metaphysics, and then we no longer have subjectum. So in this sense, Heidegger is then said to have revived subjectum under the name Geworfenheit. But I think Dugin, he doesn't go into it specifically, but it seems to me one has to say he's made it's clear he's not simply going back to ousia or subjectum, but he's making a modified version as it fits the thought of Dasein. So from within that horizon, we see something that, one, I would explicate that to myself by saying what Geworfenheit means is that originally we could understand subjectum as agenda. So Heidegger gives the example in order to show how beings change by comparing a lectern, university lectern, to what that same with the awareness that the word same, or this kind of problem, a gleich a equals a, in his lecture where he covers this notion of the concept of Aristotelian logic, the concept of identity, which already has an totally unformalized role in Socrates / Platon. with an awareness that there's no clarity on what it means for something to be the same. If we interject Newtonian metaphysics derivative off of the Cartesian grid, so we have the Cartesian grid. This is the coordinate system. This is the system for producing vector space. This becomes, in the current discussion, the Hilbert space, which is simply, so Cartesian grid is simply the simplest form of the current Hilbert space, which is one of the most crucial concepts for physicists for carrying out actual calculations. So if we look at it that way, then we say, oh, then you have an item that can be described in terms of its vector of Hilbert space, and it's both a lectern, and for some other culture, it's merely an obstacle, something like that. But then we are interjecting the whole metaphysics of Alf Clairaut, of Descartes, and the metaphysics now in power, which then gets clarified for use in daily life as the subjective and the objective, where subjective means basically non-scientific, or value, or having to do with values, something somebody wants rather than something that can be demonstrated to be the case. So the Geworfenheit is then, according to Dugin, the way I understand him, since he's pointing to Brentano, and Brentano's written about about Aristotle's idea that being is said in many ways. He's written about it specifically with regard to the so-called intentionality. So intentionality replaces then agenda, as it were, as what. So you see that if something is a lectern, that implies an agenda. It implies something to be done with that item. So it implies a future. But it's not taken anymore in Heidegger as ousia, as a present thing, but it's taken within the thinking of Dasein. So Dugin also says the way he understands Dasein is it's neither inward, it's neither inside or outside, but it's somehow on the cusp. So we could say, I think in Aristotelian thought, subjectum, the agenda, it would be something that would only be available for nous. So only for the rational being, the human being that has nous, that can intuit the essence of that lectern, know what kind of thing it is, therefore get the future through this split between the mind and the senses. So in Dasein, we could say at the very least that there's no split between mind and senses. So how is this an answer to Zizek? Actually, I've already mentioned it before, but again, let's mention it, is that what Dugin's saying is, since there's all this Geworfenheit or thrownness, or what has in the modified way has become agenda, natural agenda. So everybody, Dugin doesn't put it this way, but the way I explain it to myself is, I think the way Heidegger thought it is that we grow into a world, and in that world there's things called lecterns, and they're used in a certain way, and that's when we become human beings, we're already using everything in the way that we grow into it. So we don't have the lectern as it would be for the primitive person or the tribal person in the example they like to give, Dreyfus liked to give, was the Gods Must Be Crazy movie where the Coke bottle falls out of the air. We don't have whatever that item would be for people in another world that didn't grow up in a world where there's universities and lecterns and lectures. So in this sense, the Russian world has a specific something that people grow into, that they understand that things are as they are, but not merely that they understand them that way, but that's how they are for their Dasein. And then Dugin says from these special, so he uses all kinds of observations which have been gathered from the anthropologists. He uses the Boas, post-Malinowski anthropology of difference rather than of hierarchy, rather than of civilized, uncivilized, and savage, barbaric, civilized, or what he says is the same undeveloped and developed in the current political language, are not the same but modified from, still keeping with that kind of thinking, but modified to the current circumstances and to the current global liberal civilization. He says from within that which one grows into in a specific Dasein world, then there can still be a search for a universal. It's only that you don't start from the universal. So the position is analogous to saying there is a specific document by the United Nations about universal human rights, but it's a very specific document, and it doesn't actually represent what the truth of universal human rights. It's simply an attempt, and it's constant. And in fact, it must be continually modified as new issues arise, and according to new circumstances, just as any code of law is. So analogous to that, the whole situation of Dasein is one where, as an Orthodox Dasein, not a Catholic Dasein who has a doctrine about, in terms of dogma, in terms of what the universal canon law should be, about how to reconcile inner and outer man, canon law. Instead, there's, in Orthodox Dasein, there's the keeping open of transcendence, which then gives the possibility of, perhaps finding universal human nature, but Dugin thinks the best way to attempt that is to be more fully Russian, or more fully whatever one is, in order to, he doesn't put it this way, but I guess in Ronellian terms we could say that in order to push the test drive, in order to, or in American terms, a laboratory of democracy, but instead of laboratory of universal true dwelling, or the true mores, true way to have a world.